Hello and welcome. My name is Selma Meyerowitz, and I am a member of the class of '68, and I'm here with fellow classmate Peter Munoz to welcome you to our annual Cal Day discussion. Can Americans be civil and work together to solve public problems? This discussion is sponsored by the class of '68, the Goldman School of Public Policy's Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement, and the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science. Class of '68 members have been gathering quarterly since our 35th reunion at Homecoming 2003, holding discussions on campus with faculty, staff, and students, and building ties to classmates, not only locally, but all over the country and the world. As part of our 40th reunion gift to the campus, we founded the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement at the Goldman School of Public Policy. Thank you. The center's goal is to engage in research, teaching, fellowships, and internships, and public events, which will help students, the campus community, and the wider public achieve productive and enduring resolutions to the pressing issues facing societies today. Information about the center is on the back of the flyer you received as you came in, and additional information is available on the Goldman School website, www.gsp.berkeley.edu. And now I'd like to introduce Peter Munoz, class of '68.
Good afternoon. I'm here to introduce Dick Beahrs as the moderator for the program. Dick is a member of the class of '68 also. When he was a student here, he majored in history and was the student body president. He's now retired, but prior to retirement for 35 years, he was a media executive with Time Warner, where he was president of the Comedy Central program and of Comedy Central and of Court TV. In 2001, Dick and his wife Carolyn founded the Beahrs Environmental Leadership Program, which is a 3.5-week intensive program. And over the past decade, there have been over 350 environmental leaders from 75 countries around the world who've taken part in intensive training in sustainable development practices. Dick and his wife are both Cal grads, but I thought one of their most major accomplishments is that all 4 of their children have received degrees from Berkeley. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dick.
Thank you very much, and this is a wonderful turnout on a beautiful day, so thank you all for taking the time to come. I was struck by the topic for today's discussion, and I'm going to emphasize it this way. Can Americans be civil and work together to solve public problems? And I would say maybe we can, but we certainly aren't now. So we are in really pretty tough shape, and a thing that I'm struck by, a lot of my work on a kind of a pro bono basis has been international hunger issues. And I'm struck when we talk about the problems in the United States because to me, they are so solvable compared to the problems faced by a lot of other countries. This is a relatively rich country. We have a lot of resources, and compared that to having the same kind of discussion in Ethiopia. I mean, it's a question of where do we go? So we have, very fortunately, a distinguished panel today, and I am going to introduce them in the order in which they are going to speak. Our first speaker is Paul Pierson, who is with Jacob Hacker, has written a very interesting book on winner-takes-all politics, and you have a copy right here. I'll be like a talk show host and hold it up, but this book has been described by others as a bold and well-documented thesis on the problems that we have today. So very logically, I think we start with Paul. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on all of our speakers. You have their bios here. But in addition to being a writer of a book, Paul has written very authoritatively in a number of outstanding publications. Our second speaker is Henry Brady, who I think many of you know is the Dean of the School of Public Policy. He has extensive experience as well, having worked in the Federal Office of the Management and the Budget. He has been the director of the University of California Survey Research Center and he is also a political scientist with tremendous interest in electoral politics and political participation. I think many of you have heard him speak before on panels, and he has tremendous insights. And our final speaker is going to be the Honorable Roger Dickinson, member of the California State Assembly, representing Sacramento, California. He's been a member of their County Board of Supervisors for many years as well, and most significantly, he's a Cal letterman as well for basketball. So we can go let there be light and go Bears. So we're very pleased to have with Roger. Again, I'm not going to go into more detail on their bios in the interest of time, but you do all have it there, so please take the time to look through that. I would say one thing, that from my standpoint, a moderator should be neutral and non-partisan as well as they can be. But I'm feeling pretty cranky these days, so I fear that my perspective might spill over a little bit. But in that regard, I can't help but, for full disclosure, I'm a Democrat, but I've got a lot of friends and friends that are always trying to convince me the other perspective. And the one story I'll conclude with is my cousin, who's a medical doctor. I've known him extraordinarily well my whole life. And about 20 years ago, I told him that I had been found to be the poster child of ADD, and that it was going to be a good idea for me to start taking Ritalin so I could focus better. And he immediately turned to me and said, "Does that mean you're a Republican now?" So in any event, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Paul, and who will be speaking for about 10 minutes. And then the other speakers will follow, and so we're leaving a very substantial amount of time for question and answer, so we can hopefully really stir the pot a little bit.
Thanks, Dick. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think this will be fun and lively, I hope. So as an academic, when I was told I had 10 minutes, it made me realize I only could say one thing. Because that's about how long it takes an academic to say one thing. This is a huge topic, and I'm just going to try to pick out one piece of it. For me, the most important thing I would want to say about why I think American politics has become more polarized, why governance has been getting so much harder. And as I thought about what I wanted to say, I realized I had this feeling inside of me, well, this is probably not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to talk about general features of the system, about the role of primaries, the media, et cetera. I'm supposed to maintain studied neutrality, take the stance from Mount Olympus, looking down at both political parties and basically saying a pox on both your houses. But I don't believe that. I've been thinking about these issues for many, many years, and it's not what I believe. And I think the first thing that I owe you, even if it's bad manners, considered bad manners, maybe not so much here, and I realize I'm not exactly playing against type for a Berkeley professor and saying what I'm about to say. My one point that I want to make is that I think that the single most important cause, not the only cause, and I hope we'll talk about it, but the single most important cause of growing conflict and deteriorating governance is the dramatic, long-term rightward shift of the Republican Party. I think that's the most important factor, and I want to try to make the case that that's in fact what's happened in the few minutes that I have allowed to me. That doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of critical things to say about Democrats or about other aspects of the system, and for anybody who does get around to taking a look at this book, Winner Take All Politics, you'll see a lot of criticism of Democrats in the book. My co-author Jacob Hacker and I like to say that at least with respect to rising inequality in the United States, the dramatic rise in inequality in the United States, which is our subject, the Democrats wear gray hats and the Republicans are wearing the black hats. So, of course, it could just be bias on my part that says, because my partisanship, and this is not a secret either, could just be bias on my part, and I take that seriously. Right? I'm struck in going around having conversations with people about this, how often people react in terms of what they already think, who they like and who they don't like, rather than looking at the evidence. But what I want to suggest in the time that I have is I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is not a story where the two parties have just drifted away from each other and away from the middle, but that the action is much more on the Republican side. But I may just be biased, so you should listen to the evidence and really think about it, and think about your own biases as well, because we all have them. All right, so here are 6 pieces of evidence for my claim. I have to do this quickly. 6 pieces of evidence. See, this is why it takes 10 minutes to make one point. First piece of evidence is that if you study roll call votes in Congress, which political scientists have gotten very good at doing, and they've gotten much better at trying to track legislators over time. So you can look at Washington and see where legislators fall on roll call votes, not just compared with others in Congress at any moment, but with members of Congress in previous Congresses. What you see is that the evidence shows clearly that there's been polarization, but it shows that the polarization, the movement, has been much more dramatic on the Republican side than it has been on the Democratic side in Washington. All right? And to the extent that there's movement on the Democratic side, it's almost entirely because of one thing, that as the South turned Republican, that the most conservative Democrats weren't there anymore. All right? So it wasn't so much that the other Democrats were moving, but the balance within the caucus changed because you didn't have these conservative Southern Democrats anymore. But on the Republican side, doesn't matter what part of the country you're looking at, they're getting much more conservative, right? Much more conservative. All right? So that's a piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence has to do with the media. And here my point is simply, there is nothing like Fox News on the other side. All right? Now people can say, oh, NPR. Well, saying that they're the same in terms of partisanship is like saying, looking at a shack and looking at the Empire State Building and saying they're both buildings. All right? So just three quick points to bring that out. There are very, very close links, documented links, between the Republican Party and Fox News. Right? Roger Ailes is a former Republican operative and remains prominent, plays a prominent behind-the-scene role in Republican politics. Fox, in a way that I think is simply not true of NPR, has huge financial incentives to push partisan intensity as a way to boost ratings. Right? That's their market niche. Right? Get people agitated in partisan terms. Right? Third piece of evidence, and I'm really shocked that this has not gotten more discussion. Right? There are 3 prominent figures who are considered viable candidates for the Republican presidential nomination, who either now are or very recently have been on the Fox News payroll. Right? Unprecedented in American politics. All right? So that leads me to my third piece of evidence, which has to do with the presidential candidates. You are getting from what are considered very viable Republican candidates incredibly incendiary commentary in a way that I think we're not used to seeing in national politics. I won't go into reading the passage from Mike Huckabee's recent remarks claiming that Obama had been raised with all these ideas about Kenya coming from his Kenyan father. And then he came back and said, and his staff said, well, he misspoke. Go back and read the transcript of what he said. It was because it went on for quite a long time. It wasn't like he accidentally said Kenya when he meant to say Indonesia. There's a whole long litany there of how the connection to Kenya shaped Obama's thinking. It wasn't like a one-sentence, one-word flub. Gingrich recently said, I have 2 grandchildren. I'm convinced that if we do not decisively win the struggle over the nature of America, by the time they're my age, they will be in a secular atheist country, potentially one dominated by radical Islamists. Now, leave aside how you have a secular atheist country dominated by radical Islamists, but think about that kind of language. Think about that kind of language coming not from a fringe candidate, right, but from a prominent possible candidate for the Republican nomination. And if you look, so to take something a little bit more objective, less subjective, one way to think about potential presidential candidates and where they situate themselves is to look at what polling shows about their favorability ratings and just say, ask people whether they have a favorable or an unfavorable impression, and then just subtract the unfavorables from the favorables. And that gives you an idea of sort of how polarizing these figures are. Right? And the extent to which, I would say, also an indication of the extent to which they're playing to a base, rather than to middle America, or to mainstream opinion. There is no precedent for the number of major candidates for the presidency who are well into negative territory as compared with the Republican candidates that we have today. The majority of the people who are mentioned as possible Republican candidates are in negative territory. That means that they appeal to the base, but they don't appeal to most Americans. And two very prominent candidates, or potential candidates, Sarah Palin and Newt Gingrich, are way into negative territory. Pat Buchanan, negative territory. Al Sharpton, negative territory, right? Their poll ratings, in terms of how most Americans look at them, make them look like fringe candidates. But they are not fringe candidates within the Republican Party, right? So that to me is a real piece of evidence. Okay. Fourth piece of evidence. There is no organized moderating force in the contemporary Republican Party. Right? If you think about the Democrats over the last few decades, you had the Democratic Leadership Council, right, which was very much a moderate, middle-of-the-road political organization whose goal was to try to bring the Democratic Party as close as it could towards the center, right? And the DLC was powerful, right? Much of the leadership of the Democratic Party over an extended period of time came from the DLC. Right? Take Gephardt, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, Joe Lieberman. Right? It's not a fringe organization. It was a powerful organization. There is nothing like that in the Republican Party. Right? The organizational battles, real organized battles within the Republican Party, are between different elements of the more extreme, right? Whether the economic element or the social element. But there is nothing like, nor has there been anything like, the DLC over the last few decades as the Republicans have moved further right. Fifth piece of evidence, public opinion. Right? Just a couple of things from surveys. There is massive sympathy for the birtherist view within the Republican Party. Right? A majority, in the most recent polls, a majority of people who identify as Republican voters either believe that President Obama was born outside the United States or think that it might be true. They're not sure. Right? That is astonishing. That's a fact. It's not just my bias or just my opinion. Recent polls having to do with the conflict over the budget, independents and Democrats were very eager for compromise. Republicans were not. Right? Now I'm not talking about elected officials, I'm talking about just asking Republican identifiers. They wanted to go to the wall on this to a much, much larger extent. So I think all of this suggests that mainstream opinion doesn't count for much in today's Republican Party. Another piece of evidence, the key planks of the GOP budget plan, especially on health care, but also on taxes, right? Rather than generating new revenue from the rich by letting the Bush tax cuts at the very top expire, they want further cuts in taxes for high-income groups. Overwhelmingly, these positions are rejected in public opinion polls. Overwhelmingly, they're rejected. 2/3 of Americans do not want to see substantial cuts in Medicare. And yet, what the Republican Party is now proposing with the Ryan plan is not just substantial cuts in Medicare, but really, if you look at the logic of the programs and their proposals and how they would unfold, over a 20, 25, 30-year period, they're basically calling for the abolition of Medicare and Medicaid. Right? They're basically saying we'll move towards a system in which people over 65, you'll get a voucher which will pay for about 1/3 of your health care costs, and after that, it's up to you to convince some private insurer. Imagine some 80-year-old, right, going to some private insurer with your voucher, which covers 1/3 of your health care costs, and saying, I'd like to buy insurance, right? That's the image that is the policy that they're pushing towards, and that only 5, 6 Republicans voted against when it came up for a vote this week in Congress. Right? And that is a million miles from where public opinion is on that issue. So my sixth and final point is to look at policy and where the contemporary GOP is on policy. Newt Gingrich, you remember when Newt Gingrich came to power after the 1994 elections? And there was this huge fight. They really wanted to change things in Washington government shutdown, so on, big changes in spending priorities and so on. The Ryan plan makes Newt Gingrich look like a piker. The distance between Clinton and Gingrich was tiny. I mean, it was big, but it was tiny compared with the kinds of policy changes that the contemporary Republican Party is trying to advance. So again, I'm not saying the Democrats don't sometimes, that there isn't something to be said on that side as well, but I think we do ourselves a real disfavor if we fall into a discussion that says both parties do this, they're both the same, they're mirror images of each other. They're not. All right. If what I'm saying is true, what does that mean? The first thing it means is we need to face reality. Right? And that when we instead retreat to a view that says a pox on both their houses, we actually empower radicals, right, who want to fundamentally remake the American political system by saying that's just what parties do, or that's just what politicians do. We need to push the media to do its job and not to report in a way that basically gives its audience no capacity to figure out whether what politicians are saying is true or false and what it really means for them. And third, I would say that we need to hope that electoral defeat will bring the GOP back to its senses before that party does too much more damage to our country.
And here I was going to get up and try to make the case for Donald Trump. It seems like it's going to be harder now. Isn't that a remarkable? What is it exactly? What's going on with Donald Trump? Is he selling his television show, or is he actually trying to run for president? Which is just hard to believe, but it's quite remarkable. I grew up in places like Wichita, Kansas, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Rochester, New York, and a lot of Republicans in places like that. And indeed, I even worked in the Nixon White House, which may surprise some of you who know me, but it's actually true. And so I've known a lot of Republicans as I've gone along, and I always try to understand Republicans. It's sort of been a lifelong quest. Since some of them were in my family and so forth. So what I want to do is maybe step back a little bit and try to understand how we got here, talk a little more about structural features of the American political system and how it led us to where we are today, which I don't think Paul's wrong. I think he's got a lot of the truth in terms of where the Republican Party now is, but I want to try to understand how they got there. And I want to talk about things like polarization, how that's occurred, how loss of trust in government has occurred, how new institutional features of American politics, and he alluded to some of these, like the change in the nature of the media has really made an impact. And then also the fact that we had this great, enormously civic-minded generation that came out of World War II, and that generation's not around anymore. That was a generation that experienced World War II, and Democrats and Republicans were put together into units in the military. They got to know one another. They got to realize that they weren't demons on either side, and I think that had a lot to do with the comity which prevailed in American politics through the 50s and 60s. So let's go back to the 50s and 60s. At that time, about 75% of Americans identified with one or the other of the two major parties. Only 20% were independents. So a lot of people were partisans, but the most important thing to know about that partisanship is there were liberal, or at least moderate, Prescott Bush, the father of George Herbert Walker Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush, was essentially a moderate Republican. He was actually involved with Planned Parenthood and things like that. So you had Prescott Bush, you have Nelson Rockefeller, you have Jacob Javits, all in the Republican Party, John Lindsay, and on and on. So you had moderate and even liberal Republicans. You had conservative Democrats, as Paul mentioned. In the Democratic Party, you had George Wallace of Alabama, and of course he later broke with the party, and as did Strom Thurmond, and then John Stennis of Mississippi, and the list goes on and on. Lots of Southern conservative Democrats. So both parties had a bigger tent than they have today. There was two major dimensions of American politics. One was foreign policy, but there was general agreement upon that. We had to fight the Cold War. Yeah, there were differences of opinions. Was there a missile gap? Was there not a missile gap in 1960? But in fact, there was agreement that we had to fight the Cold War. Very little dissent on that topic. The other big issue was the economy, but basically when Dwight David Eisenhower became president, he really continued the policies of the New Deal. He did not try to dismantle the New Deal. He even had some great infrastructure programs of his own, like the National Interstate Highway System or the National Defense Education Act, which provided help for education. So he actually, in many ways, continued features of the New Deal. So the New Deal consensus was alive and well. Sure, there were disagreements, but they really weren't that major. The media, there were three major networks. They focused on all the news that was fit to print. The era of scare journalism had pretty much abated. There was a focus certainly among the three major networks about fairness, a tremendous emphasis upon trying to be fair and trying to get the facts. Journalism schools were coming along, and there was a new sense of the importance of fact-based journalism, and so that prevailed to a large degree with respect to television news. And then, as I said, political participation was characterized by this extraordinary generation which had worked together to solve the problems of the Great Depression and then solved and won the problem of World War II, and therefore had a great sense of their own efficacy, that government could get things done, that government could actually get things done, that government was important. And then the 60s came along. Civil rights issues started to change the parties. As Lyndon Johnson knew when he supported the Civil Rights Acts, that led to a situation in which Southern Democrats became Republicans and also led to a fissure within the Democratic Party. The Great Society came along, which caused a lot of debate. Was that really a good extension of the New Deal? Was it going too far? Now, some pieces of that, like Medicare, are something that Americans hold fast to. But other features of it, like the poverty programs, we're not so sure about, and a lot of that has gone away, essentially. The Vietnam War, of course, tremendously divisive issue, which really changed Americans' notions about foreign policy, led to a great debate about how interventionist should we be or could we be. And then, of course, there's the social issues that Richard Nixon first identified with busing, and then later with Roe versus Wade in 1973. We get abortion coming up to be a very important issue. And by the way, as Southern Democrats became Republicans, Midwestern conservative religious Republicans started joining with, and that also Western conservative religious Republicans, started joining with Southern conservative religious Democrats who were now becoming Republicans, and we get a new movement within the Republican Party that's very religion-based. Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, and a whole lot of attempts to start focusing upon the social issues. This is a new dimension in American politics. In the 1970s, your religious attendance, how much you went to church, had virtually nothing to do with how you voted. Today, it has almost as much to do with how you vote as the economic issues. So this is a new change in American politics, a new fissure, a new division based upon the social issues. And then, of course, all along through the 60s, there were fissures within the Democratic Party. Highly militant left-wing groups, the New Left, Black Power, welfare rights organizations. These were organizations that really helped the Republicans mobilize the silent majority, which you may remember from the Nixon years. And so that whole piece of history had an impact on creating increased polarization. The McGovern insurgency in 1972, and of course preceding that, the McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy insurgencies in '68. And then, of course, there was Watergate. Watergate led to enormous distrust of governmental institutions. We start seeing a drop in overall trust of government at that time. We also see, although at first there was some increased trust in the media institutions also started to suffer as the debate became more polemical on each side. So, in fact, institutions of all sorts started to lose the support of the American people, and there was less and less trust in those institutions, certainly in Congress and in the presidency and in government overall. So in the 1980s and 1990s and the 2000s, we have a remade Republican Party, very much focused on social issues, often focusing on them to the exclusion of anything else. In 1998, many of you may remember, the Republicans in this state ran Dan Lundgren, who focused almost exclusively on abortion as his issue. He was Catholic. He focused on that. He lost dramatically because of it. It was a big mistake for him in this state. But you had a party that was willing to focus on an issue like that, even if it meant it lost an election. And Dan Lundgren was willing to do that. And again, you see the Republican Party, in fact, being very moralistic with respect to the social issues. And what's most interesting, I think, is that moralism has slopped over into a discussion of taxes and economic policy. If you think about it, moral issues are maybe either or. You can either be for abortion or against abortion. It's hard to have a middle position. Roe versus Wade tried to do that, but if you really read that decision, it's sort of morally difficult to stomach. You know, first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. It's hard to really feel that that was sort of morally exactly right. It may be pragmatic, but it's morally a little shocking. But yeah, with economic issues, you get the sense you can always negotiate. Okay, we'll cut taxes a little bit, and we'll cut spending a little bit, or we'll increase taxes a little bit. I mean, there's just something you can do at the margin. But now the Republicans have made this into a moral issue. Taxation is morally wrong, we are told. Another dollar of taxes. Now, it's very odd when you hear that, because we're already taxing a fair amount, and you don't hear Republicans say that we should get rid of taxation altogether, although maybe sometimes it seems that way, but I don't think they really believe that. So why is it that just another dollar of taxes is so morally awfully wrong? I think there's a real oddity here that this has become such a moral issue. So we now have two camps, Democrats and Republicans, much different views of the way the world should work. During the Reagan years, some of the lessons of the Reagan years, actually I think two really important ones that have been, I think, problematic for America. One is that if you cut taxes, you'll actually get more revenues as a result. That cutting taxes leads to so much more economic activity that at a lower tax rate, you still get more revenues. Well, if you start looking at the arithmetic of that on the back of an envelope, that's almost impossible. And indeed, none of the evidence supports that. If you cut taxes by 10%, you're going to cut revenues by nearly 10%, maybe 9%, maybe 8%. It is true you'll get maybe some increased economic activity, therefore a little more revenue. But it's not the case that if you cut revenues by 10%, taxes by 10%, that you're going to get revenues actually going up. There's just no way that can happen. And yet you hear Republican politicians talking about this all the time as if it's an accepted fact. And it's just not. The other thing that came out of the Reagan years was the notion that deficits don't matter. Dick Cheney famously talked about this during the years George W. Bush is president and said, we learned from the Reagan years that deficits don't matter. Now, it is very odd then to hear a Republican Party that's now talking about how deficits are all that matter. So there is an anomaly here, to say the least. Now, we know politicians change their minds and say different things at different times, but this is really pretty astonishing change to go from deficits don't matter, it's okay if we have them mounting up as they did during the Bush years, and then suddenly to turn around and say, oh, no, they matter a lot. Now, partly this is the result of the rise of the Tea Party, which is actually not very happy with George W. Bush either, in fairness to them. But nevertheless, the fact is the Republicans have this very funny oddity with respect to these issues where they've changed completely, it seems, in just the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. So where are we? Very polarized society. And by the way, it's really important to understand what I mean by that. What I mean is that people have sorted into the political parties. It actually turns out, if you look at the population as a whole, we're not more polarized on any issue. What's really happened is now conservatives are in the Republican Party, liberals are in the Democratic Party, and there's a lot more independents who are sort of in the middle. And so the parties look like they're much more polarized, but the American people are not much more polarized. Now, if you combine very polarized parties, you combine that with the rise of Fox News and the cable news and with the internet, where anything goes, and there's a tremendous need to constantly fill up time with some kind of news or events, and so the caliber of the debate gets more and more heated. The net result is you're going to get even more polarization. And then finally, if you add to that supermajoritarian institutions like you can't get something through the Senate unless you can get through a filibuster attempt, Or in California, you can't really get taxes passed in California unless you get through a 2/3 vote in the state legislature. So you combine polarization with supermajoritarianism, it's really a recipe for not getting things done. And that's where we are right now. So, what can we do about this? Well, I think we need better institutions. You've probably heard me say this before. We need to maybe get rid of 2/3 rules. We need to make it harder to have a filibuster. So, for example, if you're going to have a filibuster, maybe you have to be on the floor of the Senate during the time you're trying to have a filibuster. Right now, that's not necessary. So members of the Senate can actually go home while the filibuster is going on. That's pretty cheap. You're not paying any price for that kind of thing. We have to have a media that's more responsible, but I'm just not at all sure how that's going to happen, given a society which puts such a premium on the First Amendment and says that, in fact, the media can pretty much say and do whatever they want. So it's really hard to figure out how you could do something with Fox News or MSNBC if you think that's a problem as well. So it would also help, though, just if we had a president who tried to keep the temperature down. I actually think Barack Obama's trying to do that to a large extent. But it will be interesting to see in the next few weeks as we get to the discussion of the debt ceiling, what kind of temperature we get to. Paul Ryan has already criticized Obama for being too partisan. I don't quite see that, but nevertheless, that's probably what's going to happen is we're going to have both sides go into their respective corners. And again, we're going to see a replay of this tremendous polarization in an inability to get things done because of our supermajoritarian institutions and the fact that we just have a time when compromise. Let me, in fact, give you a quotation. Grover Norquist, he's the man who has people sign pledges against taxes. He's made the following statement, which I actually don't quite understand because I can't quite parse it, and I think it's in horribly bad taste. But he has said this: bipartisanship is like date rape. Now, all I know from that comment is he doesn't like bipartisanship. I'm not sure I understand exactly what he's saying, and it's sort of a vile sentiment, whatever it is, but that's where we are. Thanks.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to come back for this Cal Day and join this panel. You know, I have to say I've really enjoyed listening to the two members of the faculty because my father was on the faculty here at Cal, and one of the things I learned growing up was that professors speak in 50-minute increments. So I am extraordinarily impressed to hear our two members of the faculty do such a great job in a much shorter period of time. But I know my father would certainly be smiling today if he knew I had arrived at the point where I actually was appearing on a panel with other Cal faculty members. So thank you for the invitation. I often think of a story. It comes up lots of times in my mind during the course of a day or a week, and it involves a flight from Washington to New York. Passengers on this flight were Bill Gates, Ben Bernanke, the Dalai Lama, and a hippie. And as they got on board and settled in, the plane took off, climbed to altitude on its way to New York, but partway through the flight, all of a sudden, the plane went into a major nosedive, started heading downward disastrously. Obviously, they were all terribly frightened. The pilot came back and said, you know, I've tried everything I can do to save the plane, but there's nothing I can succeed at. The plane's going in. There are 4 parachutes. I'm taking one and getting off now. And with that, he grabbed a parachute and went out the door, which left Bernanke, Gates, the Dalai Lama, and the hippie all looking at each other about what do we do now? Well, Bill Gates said, you know, I'm the smartest guy in the world. And I'm responsible for the rise of so much in our technological advancements and innovation. The world just can't afford to lose me. I've got to take one of those parachutes and go. And with that, out the door, he went with a parachute. Ben Bernanke looked at the other two and said, you know, I'm the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Not only does the economic system of the United States, the financial health of the United States and wherewithal depend on me, but in truth, it extends to the entire world. The financial system and economies of the entire world would collapse if I were to be lost. A side note, whether that hasn't already happened with his watch, but we'll leave that aside. And with that, he grabs a parachute and goes out the door. Well, the Dalai Lama and the hippie sitting there as the plane continues to dive earthward, and the Dalai Lama looks at the hippie and says, "You know, my son, I've lived a long life. I've seen and done many things. I've had the opportunity to experience all that life has to offer. You are a young man. You still have your whole life ahead of you. There's an enormous amount that you can accomplish to improve humankind. You take the last parachute and save yourself." And the hippie looked back at the Dalai Lama and he said, "You know, wise old dude, I wouldn't really worry about it too much. The smartest man in the world just jumped out the door with my backpack." And I have to tell you that story runs through my mind a lot of times in the work that I do. And I will give you a little bit of a view, perhaps, from the trenches on the subject of civility and whether it exists or does not. And when it doesn't, perhaps some of the reasons I think that it doesn't. I would tell you, first of all, with regard to the thesis that there is no civility left in modern American politics, at least in my experience, both at the local and the state governmental level, there's some truth to that, perhaps a great deal of truth to that, ultimately on big questions, important questions, but there's a lot that's not true about that. Indeed, on a daily basis, Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature do work together. We do, in fact, occasionally vote for bills from author of the other party. If you read commentary on the legislative and social scene of Sacramento, many of the authors of such observations lament the fact that it's not like the good old days when the Republicans and Democrats would hammer each other during the day in committees or on the floor of the Assembly or the Senate, and then they'd go off for dinner and drinks and have a high old time in the evening, and that's gone. We don't like each other anymore. We don't socialize with each other. We don't get to know each other. Well, it's partially true and partially not true. The fact is, we do go out together. We do see each other outside of the legislative halls on a frequent basis. We do get along civilly and socially. We just don't like the positions of the other guys. And that is a difficulty, of course, when it comes to forming public policy that supersedes ultimately, in large measure, the relationships that we have on a personal basis. But we don't develop, I think it is fair to say, the degree and nature and depth of personal relationships that existed in past times. And I would suggest to you that the primary reason for that is term limits, because people come and go so quickly. In fact, there are members of the legislature who couldn't tell you who all the other members are, and that you have to know 119 other folks, but believe it or not, you actually can remember who 119 other folks are if you have a chance to get to know them a little bit. But establishing that level of personal relationship is indeed difficult given the turnover, and it is just one of the many effects, the consequences, a number of which I think were unforeseen, of the term limits we have that are so short. But I think there are other things, at least in my observation, that explain the partisan divide perhaps more clearly, some of which have been certainly touched on in the prior remarks. But let me suggest a few, not an exclusive or complete list by any means, but some of the things that I see that color the landscape in a significant way. The first is the demographics of the state of California. And I might say I'm going to talk about California as opposed to the national picture by and large. But the demographics of this state are quite diverse, obviously, but quite segregated in many respects. We have a very large, growing, and emerging Latino population that is becoming increasingly politically awakened. They see a Republican Party which is, frankly, completely disinterested in their point of view on a number of heartfelt issues. And I think disinterested is a polite way of putting it, quite frankly. We have a population of younger people who do not see anything that is promoted by members of the Republican Party that they identify with, by and large. And on the other hand, we have a smaller, increasingly smaller percentage of an older white population that still has, I think it's fair to say, disproportionate political authority in this state. So it is not responsive to the emerging issues of those growing, particularly ethnic minority populations that we have in the state. And that leads to serious divisions over what we ought to be doing from a public policy perspective. Connected to that, but somewhat different, is the distribution of representation in this state, and that's related to reapportionment to a certain extent. We will see, as we have this new commission draw legislative districts, whether this actually changes in any kind of marked way. I'm not convinced yet that it will, but one of the interesting things about California, which is true of the nation as a whole, is we are very divided geographically as well. If you ever have occasion to look at the map of the United States of America and how it votes in presidential elections, we talk a lot about blue and red states. We're all familiar with that terminology. Well, it's literally true. If you look at a map of the United States, you will see the two coasts in presidential elections are blue. And around the Great Lakes and in that upper Midwest area and in through Iowa, and that area tends to be blue. And the rest of the country is red. The same distribution, in effect, exists in the state of California. If you look at a map of how a gubernatorial or a U.S. Senate vote goes in California, the coast is blue, with the exception of Orange County and San Diego by and large, although San Diego County voted for Governor Brown, as did virtually every other county in the state, and particularly along the coast. And there's a thread of blue which runs up through the Carquinez Straits and up into the Sacramento Valley, including Yolo County and Sacramento County generally in that vicinity. And the rest of the state is red. The inland areas of the state are red. We have moved physically to be with people we identify with politically. And I know this was captured for me in the presidential race of 2008 as I went to a Council of Governments meeting. I sat on that board at that time, which was up in El Dorado County, and I left my comfort zone of Sacramento, and I got on the freeway, with all the Obama, Biden signs and our Democratic ticket signs all over the place, and went up into El Dorado County, which is very, very, very red. And all of a sudden, it was all about McCain and Palin and Tom McClintock and a host of Republican candidates, and I felt like I'd landed on a foreign planet, not just gone to a different county. I couldn't wait till the meeting was over of the COG to retreat to my safe area of Sacramento. And maybe not literally true, but it clearly manifested the distinction between the two different prevailing views in our state simply on a geographic basis. A third element I would suggest to you has been alluded to, and it's the rightward move of the Republican Party over time, but it it shows itself up more and more in the expression of those who don't see value in government. Grover Norquist was cited earlier, and I would point to him again, and maybe he's the new prophet of this point of view that's now got wide adherence among certainly those more conservative Republicans. But he has often talked about starving the beast being government. And so we have a growing number of Republicans who believe the best thing that could happen is that government would collapse, literally collapse, because they believe that if that were to happen, what would be reconstructed would be a much more limited government. And they have concluded that just making compromises to try to get a point, whether it's on taxes or what's taught in school or on welfare or anything else, is never going to get them back to that idea of limited government that they would like to see. And so it becomes very difficult, I would suggest to you, to negotiate with someone who doesn't want to negotiate. They want failure. They want failure. And you cannot negotiate with someone who is unwilling to engage in a discussion about trade-offs. Finally, I would say that we look at what we're doing in state and in federal government on the basis of how people in government behave. But increasingly, we see outside pressure determining how someone chooses to vote or what they will support. I think this is most clear on the right, but it's not absent from the left by any stretch of the imagination. But I again would suggest to you, if you look at the dynamics of what's happening in Sacramento right now in the state legislature, we have people who are literally frightened to death of making a deal. Because they know if they do make a deal, they are going, whatever the deal is, because they can't get everything on the wish list. So whatever the deal is, they know they are going to be criticized by the radio DJs, by the bloggers, by the folks who are going to say, you are not pure enough. And there's enough of a thread for them to believe that to make a deal signals the end of their political career. Now, I would tell you, I don't think, honestly, when you come down to it, that politicians are any less courageous, perhaps no more courageous, but no less courageous than many of us in our daily lives and the choices that we make that are crucial to our futures, our families, our careers. But we see people who are paralyzed by the fear of what will happen to their professional career if they make a choice that brings us to an agreement. And again, it is very hard to figure out how to break through that degree of fear. I, nonetheless, despite all this, believe that there are those in both parties who understand that this state, this nation, needs to find that spot where we can agree enough to continue to move forward, because after you get through it all, I would argue to you that we all still have a strong, deep, and abiding faith in this state and in this country, what it stands for, what it represents in the world, what it can be. And despite our very sharp differences over how to get there, the people I serve with in the legislature, I would suggest to you, remain committed to finding a pathway back to a brighter future for California.
Okay, we have considerable time for questions. I'm going to take the liberty of just making an observation. I think one thing is I agree with virtually everything the panelists have said, but I don't want the Democrats to escape without a case study of mine, which I think reflects the fact, a great concern I have, that there's a lack of political will out there. And I'm going to use as an example the Farm Bill. I don't know how many of you are aware of the Farm Bill, which I think is about as bad a piece of legislation as you could ever have. And it's one that I've always joked, I would love to debate the Farm Bill with anybody, anywhere, anytime, because I would have the facts so much on my side that even if I didn't present them well, I'd have a reasonable shot to do pretty well. But what happens, the Farm Bill comes up about every 4 or 5 years. It involves tens of billions of dollars of subsidies going to people that don't really need it. And when the last Farm Bill passed, you had the Republicans and the Democrats competing to make the bill worse. I mean, it's like, okay, you're going to do 50 billion, we'll do 60 billion. And in fact, it isn't only a question of the money. It leads to high fructose corn syrup being artificially cheap, which leads to obesity and the like. It distorts trading systems internationally. Poor farmers are savaged by this. So then, I'll get back to the point that was made by a number of people. Having been in the media for 35 years, I will confess I am very, very embarrassed by the media. I mean, it is appalling. We make a joke about Donald Trump, but it's the media that goes to Donald Trump. I turned on the TV very early in the morning when there was the question of whether we were going to have a government shutdown. I went to all the cable news networks, and all they were talking about was Donald Trump. I mean, it's truly remarkable. So anyway, the end of my digression, and thank you for your tolerance. Now, in terms of questions, maybe I'll go. I usually would ask a question myself, but because I've had my chance to say a little bit, I'll open it right up to the floor for questions. Yes.
And we have microphones.
I have, this question is for all of the speakers. If you have one advice for President Obama so that the two groups would work together, what will that be? And also at the same time, if you have one advice for the young people so they can think beyond, I'm a Democrat and I'm a Republican, so that we can work harmoniously, what would that be?
Well, let me just take the young people, which is, it would be great if we had more young people who voted. Part of the problem we have right now with some of the discussions that are going on is that it's seniors who vote, and therefore some of the issues revolving around Medicare really are focused on the fact that you don't want to make the seniors upset. So some changes we could make in Medicare that would actually make it work better are very hard to do because we're doing things like, even in the Ryan plan, exempting people 55 years and older, and it's not clear we should be doing that. If young people voted more, there'd maybe be more focus on the needs of young people, like K through 12 education, higher education, and so forth.
Question on this side? Or anyone else want to speak to that?
Well, yeah, I'll just say a word about President Obama. I have to say what Roger was saying about the difficulties of making deals, given the incentives that some politicians face. I think that really resonated with me. I think it's very true in Washington today. And one other element of it that I think has shown up in the last couple of years, I actually think Newt Gingrich was the first person to figure this out when he became Speaker of the House. If you can make agreement difficult, you can not only block your opponent, you can make him look bad. Right? So, and I think the minority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, recognized this. He actually came right out and said that he recognized this early on and was rallying Republicans not to make an agreement with President Obama because on a variety of issues, because if you had some kind of bipartisan agreement, most voters were likely to think it's probably a reasonably good idea. And most of the benefit for that politically was likely to redound to the president rather than to the minority party. So you have this perverse set of incentives, which I think Henry was also talking about. We've moved towards a system that's more like parliamentary parties, right? Really strong, organized parties that are opposed to each other that look more like what you have in a parliamentary system. But we don't have a parliamentary democracy, right? So what parliamentary democracies have is the majority gets to make policy until the next election. And then people can decide whether they like that or not. If they don't like it, then they can vote in the opposition. We have a system where the majority gets elected, the minority can stop them from doing all sorts of things and make them look bad in the process. How many Californians realize what is really going on right now in Sacramento and the fact that what is actually a pretty small minority party, right, just barely over a third in the two chambers, can stop a budget from happening, right? And the thing is, you don't just win on policy terms when that happens, you win politically. If you can make the other guys who most people think are in charge, if you can make them ineffective, you win politically. That's a very, very dangerous set of incentives. And that's a situation, I would say that's the situation that President Obama is in right now. And in that situation, I think it's very, very difficult to reach a bipartisan agreement on important issues. I actually think he's doing about the best you can, which is to try to indicate in a repeated way that you are open to compromise. And I think the budget proposals they're making, I think the health care bill, the health care bill, it was the Republican proposal for health care reform only a few years ago, and now it's communism. So, I think he is trying to signal that he's going to reach out. But to be honest, I don't think the Republicans face much incentive to reach any kind of agreement with him, partly for the reasons that were expressed earlier, and also because if you can make them look ineffective, this was Gingrich's great discovery. If you can make the other guys look ineffective, right, you can win politically.
Yeah, I would concur with that entirely. I'd just say with respect to youth that encouraging young people to become civically engaged is, I think, a very important message for them to hear from elders, from adults. It's not something that we stress very, very much. We don't do a very good job teaching government in school. There are too few families where what's discussed are what's going on in the community or in the state or in the country. Doing things like making sure you take your kids to the polls with you when you vote, or if you vote absentee, have them sit down and go through a ballot with you just to see what you're doing, and explaining why it's important to them, explaining that it doesn't take actually much to change things. The great historical reference is John Kennedy's election, a vote per precinct across the country. In my own case, I was elected to the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors the first time by about 25 votes. I was elected to the State Assembly by 202 votes. So I know close elections. But what I know more importantly than that is that it matters. And people think, young people certainly, I think, disproportionately so, it makes no difference what they do. But I have seen one person change the course of a policy debate or an issue at the local level. And so I think educating young people to what we do, trying to encourage them to be civically involved, and demonstrating for them that we are, because it matters, is very, very important.
On this side, way in the way back.
Hello. I'm hearing a bit of cynicism from the two professors on government. So I'm fairly young, and I actually trust government a lot. I think they had remarkable legislation during the financial crisis. There was good compromise, and there was even international collaboration. There was a health care bill passed, and during the lame duck session, you had the START II treaty ratified. And I think the news media is more informative than it's ever been. So it may be polarized, but at least the sides are representing their sides well. So I'm wondering if something about the cynicism a bit is detracting young people from being more involved in government.
Well, part of the reason young people don't participate is that they've really never much participated, and there are just reasons why they don't. They move a lot, and therefore it's hard to get involved often because of that. Another problem is that it actually turns out you learn about how to think about politics and how to vote as you do it. There's real evidence that if you've done it once, then you're going to probably do it again. So this gets back to Roger's point about how important it is to have it start in the family, because you can get your children ready to be into the political realm by taking them aside and having them get involved in what you're doing. And I think that, and we show too that one of the things that has the biggest impact on young people getting involved in politics is, did they discuss politics at home with their family? So just dinner table conversation. Now, of course, unfortunately, dinner table conversation has gone by the wayside in the modern era, where fewer and fewer people eat together, and that's a problem as well. But that's certainly one place it can happen.
Well, I'm a huge believer that government can make a positive difference in people's lives, and I think you're quite right to point out those policy outcomes in the last session of Congress, which I think, I mean, I would have definite criticisms to make about them. I don't think that the financial reforms went nearly as far as they needed to go, given the depth of the crisis that we are still experiencing. Right? I know it was a long time ago, 2008, way back then. But it's amazing how quickly we've moved on to think that somehow the financial crises that governments are facing, both at the local and state level and at the national level, are somehow some inherent product of government rather than a product of a really devastating financial crisis. But you're right, policy can definitely make a difference. And I would say political scientists we suffer, it's an occupational hazard that we sometimes are encouraged to be cynical, to think that everything's being driven by narrow self-interest. At the same time, when I look at the budget proposal that just passed the House of Representatives, and I mean, study it, come to your own conclusion, read from a variety of sources, some of which will inform you well, some of which will not. Remember the statistic I gave before, half of Republicans think there is or may be something to this birtherism idea. Okay, now to me, I mean, to me, that is a really telling statistic about whether the media is doing a good job of informing people about fundamental matters. But I think it is clear that legislation, if it were going into effect, would mean the end of Medicare and Medicaid as we have known them for the last 40 years or so. So if you want to call it cynicism as opposed to alarmed realism.
The man in the way back, standing.
I'd like to pose a suggestion, a modest suggestion to you academicians and practicing politicians. We have one party, and I won't name it, which is absolutely insane. So why don't we just cave in and do everything they want to do and then stand back and see what happens? I think it would would be a wonderful education for our public, and the future would look very bright after that.
Do that in the state of California if we're not careful with respect to the all-cuts budget. That's where we're heading right now, and that's very scary. I guess just to be very self-interested, it's very hard to know how the University of California would survive in its present form if we have an all-cuts budget. As it is, the current budget, which is before the all-cuts budget, it's only a $500 million cut in the University of California. That's devastating to us right now, and we're going to have to do some very, very, very fancy footwork to get through the next 3 or 4 years, basically borrowing to get through those years as we hope we get a plan to find a way out. Another cut of that magnitude, I don't see how we get there. Well, there is talk about finally saying let's shut down some campuses.
Let me just
I hope it's not
let me just say that this is a sentiment that rises from time to time in majority and in Democratic circles, which is let's go out and let's put up all the cuts to the extent that the Republicans have advocated for them, and let's see what happens. The chances are, I mean, the odds are they wouldn't vote for him either, by the way. But then the question is, who's willing to take that risk? And so, it becomes a fairly dangerous game to play, to call their bluff. And I think it probably is a bluff, ultimately. But when you have spent your life, both in and out of politics, for example, as I have, trying to work on things and build them up to improve a community, you're very leery about even taking any risk that could all be decimated because some people are foolish enough to go nuclear. And so I think that's what restrains that scenario from playing out. But believe me, on certain days, there's a heck of a lot of sentiment for just that approach to put them to the test.
One thing I'd like to take the liberty of making a comment on the observation you made about media, and on some of the positives of it. I think it's really a fascinating time, which I'll borrow from Dickinson. The best of times, the worst of times, in the sense that all of us, have a better chance to get our point of view expressed. Blogs, Huffington Post, this, that, all the chatter. You look at what happened seemingly spontaneously in Egypt and the like. There have been a lot of exciting things. At the same time, where I'm very, very critical is the old networks, CBS, NBC, and the ABC, because of the way they're responding to competition and they're just going into the marketplace. And it is, I can tell you from the reality of having been there, it is ratings driven. And, they're talking about Donald Trump because more people want to hear about Donald Trump than they want to hear about climate change. So we've got this tough situation where more ways to express ourselves, but everything is so splintered and balkanized that no one is kind of framing the debate in a meaningful way where we can all kind of raise our hand. So I think one of the things that's going to be interesting is how all this evolves. What you'd like to see is if someone comes up with craziness like the birther stuff, they pay a penalty for it as opposed to being rewarded. And by the way, in answer to your question, Donald Trump will not run for president. He's promoting his TV show. That's my opinion, okay?
Oh, darn.
Yeah. Right here. I'll get you next.
I've thought a lot about why all this fear-mongering is so successful right now, and kind of the hypothesis that I come to, and I'd like panelists' response. People are afraid. They're scared to death, and they're still afraid over 9/11, and we haven't effectively met that threat. It appears that we're probably losing the war on terror, if anything, I believe. We've been in Afghanistan now 10 years. Think back to the Vietnam era when we just pulled up stakes and walked away. People are scared, and that's why the fear-mongering is successfully done right now.
I think people are scared, and it's really important to understand how much that affects politics, and especially on the Republican side with the groups that they're appealing to. I think they're scared right now about jobs, by the way, and realistically and reasonably so. It's a terrible time out there if you're looking for a job. I think they're also worried about changing ethnic composition of the places they live. So in the state of California, the white population that votes more than the rest of the population that's even eligible to vote, they are very worried about looking at a state that's changing in its ethnic composition, and change is hard. They're not sure what it's going to mean, and they're not sure that they want that to happen, and they'd like to stop it. And so there's been a variety of things that have occurred that have been attempts to try to stop it. Of course, it's not going to be stopped. It's where it is right now, and it's going to continue that way.
Yeah, I agree with Henry. I think so 9/11 could be part of it, but I think the fear is more multifaceted than that. And I do think economic anxiety is a very, very big part of the story, both in the short run, this immediate crisis that we've been living with for the last few years, but it's also a much more long-term story. The middle class for the last 30, 40 years has really struggled. There's been a sharp rise in inequality, with those at the very top of the income distribution getting almost, so the top 1% has gotten almost 40% of income growth in the United States over the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. Right? To the extent that middle class incomes have grown at all, they've grown only because people are working more hours. Right? And then when people look forward, they look ahead and they think about, am I going to have health insurance? Is there going to be a pension? Am I going to have a job? People are incredibly anxious, right? And one of the things that I think is you could say this is too cynical or negative, but I think it is something to really be concerned about, is that people can play politically, they can play on those kinds of fears and direct them in different directions. They're not necessarily directed towards the right targets. And that, I think, makes a kind of sunshine view that says, look, the system's going to be self-correcting. If government does a bad job, then the right people will be put in place and they'll correct the problem. I don't think there's any reason to think that that's going to happen automatically, which is why civic engagement, civic education is so important. Ordinary Americans need to really be involved and inform themselves.
I must say, one of the things that surprises me is that the Republican Party and Paul Ryan have put forward a plan that it seems to me is really going to accelerate a lot of those fears when people start really realizing what we're talking about, which is getting rid of Medicare. And many of you may think that Medicaid doesn't affect you, but the truth is Medicaid often pays for elderly parents who have run out of funds and then need some nursing care help. So Medicaid actually helps the middle class as well. It's not just for poor, impoverished people with children in middle ages. It's also for elderly people as well. So I just don't see how that bet is going to work, but maybe it will. I don't know. Roger?
I would certainly agree that I think fear is a dominant factor right now, and that it is much more driven by economic insecurity than it is physical insecurity. I also think that there's another element to this fear equation, and that's people fear loss of control over raising their children and over the nature of life in their community. It's in part related to the changing demographics of our state and our country, but I think it's more that people feel they can't control the inputs, the influences, especially on their children. It goes back to the vast array of means of communication. It's not just media. It's social media. It's all those things that's led to a level of insecurity about I'm not raising my children. Someone else is raising. I don't know what my child's going to be subjected to, and I don't know how to deal with it. So I think that those are for me the twin dominant characteristics of the fear. But I think if you look through history, it's quite clear when economic times are hard is when fear rises to the greatest extent. And fear is an enormously powerful emotion. A few years ago, this was quite clearly demonstrated to me when UC Davis made an application to establish a bio-level 4 lab on the campus, and that is the highest level of bio-level lab that looks at all the worst things that could possibly affect us. There was a group of people in Davis who just became obsessed with the idea that whatever was going to be looked at and research done on in that lab was somehow going to sneak out into the environment and kill all of them. I mean, they were afraid that hantavirus was going to be carried out by some researcher or somebody else and infect the entire city and beyond. Well, hantavirus occurs naturally in the environment. But the fear, once they had that fear, there was no ability whatsoever to sit down and have a rational discussion about it. And so the hard part about dealing with fear is that it overcomes the rational senses, and it's very, very difficult to get people to sit down and think logically and rationally about their future, about an issue, anything of that kind when they've succumbed to fear.
Question on this side.
Yeah. Okay. Full disclosure, I'm a Democrat, but I want to play a little devil's advocate in the sense that the idea of tax policy. The idea has been criticized that Republicans feel that cutting taxes can in fact raise tax revenue. But there is support among some economists, the idea of the Laffer curve, that sometimes in our history, one example being the Reagan administration, where tax cuts have in fact raised tax revenue. And I mean, I know there's a debate about where we are on that curve today. I'm not saying necessarily agree with this, but there is support for the idea that sometimes cuts in taxes can raise revenue, and there is some economists that believe that. So I think that is an important fact to discuss, and I was curious what your opinions on that are.
I mean, there's just no empirical evidence for that. The data are not there. And also just a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Think about what's required. Tax rates are maybe essentially like 20%, okay? So that means that if you're going to raise more revenue, you have to believe that when you cut taxes, you expand at the margin economic activity by a factor of at least 5. That'll just get you to break even. That's an enormous amount. So in other words, $1 of tax reduction is going to lead to $5 more of GDP. And therefore, at 20%, you'll just break even. You'll get the $1 back in revenues. There's just not multipliers out there in any economic models I know of. No empirical research I've ever seen. It's just a fantasy.
So I mean, theoretically, what you're saying is right. Like at some point, you would reach a marginal rate of tax, right? That was so high, so confiscatory that would kick in. But we are nowhere. We are nowhere near that point. And we've had now 3 grand experiments on this in the last 30 years. The Reagan tax cuts, some people argued that they would generate enough revenue to make it revenue neutral or better. It did not, right? I mean, tax revenue fell, deficits grew. Same thing happened with
had to raise taxes.
And then Reagan had to come back. Same thing happened with the Bush tax cuts in 2001. Right. And in between, we had a round where, in order to balance the budget, the Clinton administration and Democratic Congress raised taxes on high-income taxpayers, and we were told that that would be a disaster and that revenues would fall and that we would go into a recession, and none of that happened. It closed down the deficit. Right? So, I mean, we've had 3 really good empirical experiments with it in the last 30 years.
By the way, Charles Blow today in the New York Times editorial page, I think it's today, has a chart of GDP growth and marginal tax rates, and says there's absolutely no relationship between the two.
Yes, right here in the 3rd row on the aisle. Right behind you.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the comment earlier about the growing number of independents who have been disenfranchised and are not part of the 2 parties. And so 2 questions. One is, could a 3rd party ever be viable in this country? And secondly, what could the Democrats do to expand the tent to bring more of those people into the fold?
Well, I think that taking the second part of that, what Democrats have to do, it seems to me, is articulate a vision to people who have issues that Democrats, in a partisan sense, haven't spoken very well to. The increasing polarity of the parties, I think, has led Democrats as well as Republicans increasingly to talk to their base. And that's part of the reason why we've seen growth in independents. Of course, independents tend to be paying less political attention, too. That's part of the definition of why people are independents. But I think the kind of issues that resonate largely with independents are issues of fiscal responsibility, of personal responsibility, of social responsibility, and those are things that, frankly, Democrats, I believe, are for and ought to be for. We need to be articulating for people why we invest in education, why we think that's important, why we want to get more money into prevention to help kids and families get a good start in life and then be able to build on that for future success. I think independents are looking for someone or a party that looks at their issues about economic security and about family stability and is waiting for someone to speak to those in
a way that's not simply phraseology, not just what the religious right articulates, which I think doesn't resonate with most independents as being reality. So I think there's a real opportunity. But it is a matter of directing a message to people that speaks to what they're concerned about.
I'm going to make an observation. We have only 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is have one more question. I think we're due to have it from...
Let me just say a sentence about
yeah, sure.
Third parties are very hard in America because political parties in our system would love to have a monopoly, but the next best thing is a duopoly, 2 parties. And so they agree that at least there should be no more than 2 parties.
I'd just say very quickly as well, with the 2 top primary, top tier 2 primary in California, you will not see third parties rise here. It kills them right out of the box.
Okay, we have one more question right here, and then I'm going to invite each of the panelists in response to the question or independently if you want to make any closing observations. Then I'm going to invite Didi von Lobenselz from the class of 68 to come up to close the session. And I'm also going to encourage the panelists, I mean, obviously we're not lacking for questions here. I don't know what your schedules are after this, but if you wouldn't mind holding around a little bit, maybe you can have smaller discussions with people from the audience.
This just relates to Professor Pierson's point about economic insecurity. It seems like there are a whole new bunch of deep-rooted problems in terms of people need a college education but increasingly aren't getting it, and even if they have it, they might not get the jobs that they deserve that would give them the middle-class lifestyle. People's benefits are getting cut as medical costs are going up. People will get $80,000 one year, $20,000 the next year, and then even though a lot of companies are making profits, they're not rehiring, so you have the structural unemployment. And then the people who are the most needy are increasingly isolated. So given the current political deadlock, can government do anything to do this? And if there is capacity to do something, what should government do to try and tackle these issues?
Easy.
You have a minute. Okay, so I mostly just want to say, I'm going to try to say something about that huge question. But I mostly just want to thank the organizers and my fellow panelists for what obviously is a discussion that leaned in one direction, but I think we touched on a lot of the really important issues that come up in these, on what are really fundamental questions for, I think, all citizens to be wrestling with. I'm a big believer in government. I'm a big believer in what we used to call the mixed economy, right? Which is that capitalism has been an enormous success, right? But tempered capitalism, in which we recognize that markets can't do everything, right? Has been an even greater success. Right? And partly, and this is actually Jacob Hacker and I are starting to work on a new book, which is sort of like, when did we decide that the mixed economy was such a bad idea? Right? Which, to me, the greatest innovation, the greatest force for human progress of the 20th century was discovery of the mixed economy. That markets were really good at doing some things, most things even, but that you needed some system of checks and balances to pick up on the things that it couldn't do, or that it wouldn't be encouraged to do well without some sort of structure of incentives. For example, that says, it would be a good idea if we didn't cook the planet, right? So you need government, right? You need government. And I would say, and I don't actually think that's a partisan issue. It didn't used to be a partisan issue. There used to be a disagreement about exactly what the balance was, but I think Roger's absolutely right. It is really striking to see, the resurrection of Ayn Rand, who, to my mind, an infantile social theorist, infantile, right? The idea that we should have a libertarian society in which everybody gets to do whatever they want, right? I can build a nuclear power plant in my backyard, right? And that's just, free to choose. It's infantile, right? So we need, I think all engaged citizens, first thing that we need to be doing is talking about why you need a role for government in a civilized society, which includes, for example, people being willing to pay some taxes. And then you can have an argument about what the balance should be, right? That would be a civilized discussion, a civil discussion.
Henry?
He said it so well.
As a closing word, well, I would say I've really appreciate, again, the invitation. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I want to return to the cynicism issue for just a second, because I've noticed there's a little bit of it about elected officials. John Diaz wrote an interesting column in the Chronicle last week in which he essentially said, I've known a lot of elected officials, and by and large my experience is they're highly and well motivated, they care deeply, they are trying to do the best they can for their communities, their state, their nation, whatever it might be. And I think when we think about elected officials in particular, or government employees in general, it's important to make some distinctions. We can all be influenced by those who we think are going to have some effect in a meaningful way on our lives and on our careers. That, I don't think, should necessarily make us cynical. But in large measure, people, in my experience as well, who are in public office and in public employment, are truly interested in public service. I may disagree with them on what they want to do as a policy or fiscal matter, but I recognize the sincerity of their effort. It doesn't really, in my judgment, advance our state or nation to look at people who choose to serve and assume that they're doing it for the purpose of trying to improve their own personal circumstances. I think increasingly we're seeing that, and the latest illustration is what the Compensation Commission did this week with respect to cars for state legislators. Now, I say that, I drive my own car, so I don't have a state car, but the point of this really is that if we want the most capable and the best and brightest among us to hold public office and be willing to seek it, we also have to understand that there are sacrifices that come along with that, and we have to be prepared to compensate people in a way that encourages them and doesn't disincentivize them to run. And that I'm afraid is increasingly becoming the case, that people say, I wouldn't put up with that. You're not going to get me to do that and go through what people have to put up with. So I think it's just something to think about as we consider the character and the quality and the nature of the people who are willing to seek office and serve in it. That generally speaking, they're motivated by the right things, but it's not so much those of us who serve. It's who's deterred, who's not serving, who's not willing to run because they aren't willing to put up with the cynicism.
Well, I'd like to say too that I think we increasingly think sometimes in California that it's just those bad legislators. If we could just get rid of the bums and get a new group, everything will be fine. The trouble is we put them in circumstances where they make decisions that end up not being very good ones, but that's because we have things like term limits and two-thirds rules and a whole set of initiatives that really make it almost impossible to come up with good legislation. We're more the problem. The people are more the problem than the legislators. We've got to take some responsibility. We've got to find better ways to allow them to do their business and to do it better, to do our business and to do it better.
And I have to say my last words are go Bears.
Thank you all for coming. What a great turnout. So on behalf of the Travers Department of Political Science and the Goldman School of Public Policy and the Class of '68 Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement, we want to thank our panelists for giving us a great inspirational afternoon.